Welcome to The Spy in the Hanoi Hilton with David Taylor and Robert Wallace. I'm Amanda Olkey. I'm the Director of Adult Education here at the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. And I really want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to say a few more words about David, but I have our Executive Director, Chris Costa, who would like to make some remarks. Thank you, Chris.
So good evening, everyone. Thank you, Amanda. And of course, we have an amazing virtual audience. So I'm really excited about this particular program. And Amanda does such an amazing job of running these programs that I don't normally need to come to the podium. And I certainly didn't need to come to the podium tonight, except for the fact that when I first heard about this program, I realized the importance of making sure the public knows more about this story. And I'm very excited that we brought in our special guests tonight. And just to personalize this a little bit, years ago in the 1990s, I went to Department of Defense high-risk survival and resistance training. And that was the first time that I experienced just a snippet of the travails of somebody that might be in captivity and learn some of the techniques to resist hostile interrogation. Again, just a snippet, knowing it was training. And that's when I was exposed to Admiral Stockdale and other prisoners of war during the Vietnam era and some of what they endured. We saw video clips and we learned of their travails and all that they went through so that we could share some of those lessons. But what I didn't know is the story that we're going to hear from Jim and Dave and Bob this evening. I didn't understand the depth. One areas I stayed away from, even here at the Spy Museum, was talking about resistance techniques and things that I had learned in the classroom. That said, what you're going to hear tonight is declassified, and we have an opportunity to share with the public, and it is such an important story. So I'm really excited to have people in person here this evening and to share this on our virtual channel. So Amanda, I'm going to turn it back to you. But again, Jim, Dave, and of course, Bob Wallace, who's been a longtime supporter and an advisor at the International Spy Museum. I thank you for sharing this story with our audiences tonight. I'm going to kick it back over to you.
Right. And I'll come out of the shadows. And it's always exciting when Chris tells us a little bit more about his background, because some of it he keeps very secret, as you would expect. So now I know some probing questions to ask him at our next meeting. So we are really, really pleased to have documentarian and former BBC producer David Taylor with us this evening. And he is going to take us behind the scenes of his film, The Spy in the Hanoi Hilton. And we really want to emphasize that this film was made with the support of the Pentagon and the CIA. So we're not going to get in trouble for showing this film, I hope. So David's going to screen some key clips at the beginning, and then he's going to be joined on stage by some of the people that Chris has alluded to, and David is going to give them more robust introductions, but one of them is the fabulous Robert Wallace, one of my favorite Spy Museum Advisory Board members. And so we're really lucky to have all of the speakers with us tonight. And after the clips and the conversation, which will be led by David, we'll turn to your questions. Enough from me, enough preamble. Let's see some of this film. David Taylor, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Tonight is going to be a really good opportunity for me to do something that I wasn't able to do when I was making these films. It turns out that I was doing a story over 20 years that covered 3 documentaries that I made, and it was only after I put it all together I realized that it was actually the same story, just with 3 key elements. One was a film I did for National Geographic on World War II. Then I did a documentary on the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And then we have this film, The Spy in the Hanoi Hilton. You may be wondering how on earth you connect these. Well, for me, this is an opportunity because at the time, one was for National Geographic, one was for BBC, the final one was for Smithsonian. So my opportunity tonight is to try and explain to you how they all come together. What I'm going to be doing is playing clips from 3 of these films with emphasis at the end on the Hanoi Hilton documentary. But I thought it was important to try and explain to you how on earth you come across these films and how you then, as we say, it was, I trust, declassified. There was a moment where I was invited to the agency to show this film, and I was standing there and it was introduced by the head of the clandestine service. And his opening remarks is, we all here in the clandestine service marveled at this documentary, at how much classified material you'd managed to cram into one 45-minute film. I assume he wasn't serious, but anyway, I managed to escape and all went well. So I'm going to start by doing a clip from the documentary, which allows you to understand. I tried at one point in one of the films to explain what was the basic premise behind The Spy in the Hanoi Hilton. So this is how I began the film.
February 1973. America's long nightmare in Vietnam is finally brought to a close. "591 American prisoners of war held by the North Vietnamese are coming home. They are the lucky ones. The war cost over 58,000 American lives and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese.
We are profoundly grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to our nation for this day. God bless America. God bless America.
The returning prisoners of war are told one crucial part of their story is top secret, only to be discussed in a series of classified debriefs that last days, even weeks.
Mr. Chief, is classified secret, no foreign dissemination authorized, and distribution is limited to a need-to-know basis.
And then it's behind our back, and then they would take a rope and tie it around your elbows.
These sessions, heard here for the first time, document how POWs inside Vietnamese prisons secretly communicated with military intelligence and with the CIA. One debrief in particular sheds light on this classified program. It involves a Navy commander who survived 2,621 days in captivity to become a Vice Admiral, Medal of Honor recipient, and candidate for the Vice Presidency of the United States.
This is the debriefing of Captain James Bond Stockdale, U.S. Navy, on 19 February 1973.
This is James Bond Stockdale, as he appeared as a POW during the almost 7 years of incarceration. The debrief he did for the Department of Defense when he came back was an amazing document, about 450 pages of the most minute detail of almost every day that he spent in captivity. What you discover when you go through the archive, through the debrief, and I'll explain how I was able to get it, you were able to understand just what he was able to achieve inside that prison and how he was able to establish a communication network that reached all the way back to Washington. It was a communication network that started in his letters that he sent home. This is one of the letters. The reason why it's significant to the CIA and to the Institute, to the Pentagon, was the way it began. The description there, to darling. Darling meant in the letter that what was contained in this letter was encryption code which would be extracted by the CIA. This was the beginning of the operation. When I started to go through the debrief that he had done for the Pentagon, I realized that the things he was describing, the cooperation between the prisoners and the CIA and the Office of Naval Intelligence, was not a new concept. that what I was uncovering was actually something that I had uncovered as a journalist many years before I did the Hanoi Hilton film, when I was going through the Washington Post, and it was a metro section. And they said that they were going to put a flagpole up at this location 5 miles from where we are in Washington. This is a flagpole to be erected at Fort Hunt, Virginia. The article said it was to dedicate the work of a classified unit from World War II. My immediate thought is, what could conceivably be classified from World War II 60 years later? So that became my mission, to try and find out what on earth was this program. And what you discovered, and what you'll see now, is how it reflected so many of the things that they ultimately did in Hanoi with the prisoners. But this is how I started the film about Fort Hunt and a unit called Military Intelligence Service X, or MIS-X.
One of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II begins here, at this former military base. Today, nothing remains of the facility known as Military Intelligence Service Department X, or MIS-X. Yet for the final years of the war, this was the source of an invisible hand that maintained contact with prisoners held in more than 60 German camps. It included Stalag Luft III, the site of the Great Escape. MIS-X had two goals. First, facilitate POWs' efforts at escape. Maps, compasses, forged documents, German money, even cameras were smuggled into the camps. MIS-X was also transforming American prisoners into spies behind enemy lines.
So you can already see the parallel with what was about to happen with the Hanoi Hilton. This particular program is something you can explore here at the museum. When I went up to the 5th floor, you actually see some of the devices that were shipped into those prisons from the men at Fort Hunt. What you'll find are cameras. At the bottom there is a compass, which was inside the jacket buttons that were sent into the camp. Very cleverly, they just reversed the thread. So when the Germans tried to open it up to see if there's anything inside, all they were doing is tightening it. And then they had playing cards, and these were silk playing cards where they could open up the playing cards and reveal a map inside. And when they put all the playing cards together, it was a map showing them where they were in relation to Switzerland and the Swiss border and possibly freedom. But when I was looking through my story, and I was looking at the various efforts that were done at Fort Hunt, which included secret writing, which you'll learn is very important for the Jim Stockdale story. But you also realize that this was the site they were shipping things in to facilitate the Great Escape. And let me assure you that almost everything you saw in the film was not untrue, but they were missing the huge component, which is the help they were getting from Fort Hunt. And the one I really liked is at the top there in the left. That is a working cribbage board. It could be played as cribbage, but if you put the pins in a certain position, it turns out that it becomes a shortwave radio with only the ability to pick up one frequency, which is the BBC long service. And so as a former BBC person, I was fascinated that the corporation had actually played a role in British intelligence, MI9, and American intelligence at Fort Hunt. So I'm going to show you just one more clip from the Great Escape story I did, but it shows how the BBC, and you can imagine the CIA and Brian Littman eventually played such an important role in the prisoners trying to get out of Stalag Luft III.
65 years ago, its very isolation hampered Washington's efforts to help the POWs. It took MIS-X more than 3 months to exchange a coded message with a prisoner. In London, British intelligence faced the same problem, but then the BBC joined the effort.
The country is face to face with a grave crisis.
The broadcaster incorporated coded messages into its news bulletin that reached as far as Poland. Now the challenge was to get secret radios to American prisoners. Master craftsman Jim McTighe went to work.
He was a tremendous man. He was always business. I saw him smile twice, and I knew him for a couple of years. The man was very good with working out a problem.
McTighe's genius was to transform a cribbage board into a working radio. It was capable of picking up the BBC signal from London.
This is the product that we started out with in production, and it's a cribbage board. This is a glued up piece. Now this is ready for grooving and finishing.
A crystal radio was hidden inside the board. Nails placed in certain holes allowed the set to pick up the BBC's long-wave programs. Codemaster Silvio Bedini did the rest.
My job was to create a system that I could put into that program so somebody somewhere, Poland, Germany, can listen and be able to pull that message out.
There's a deafening roar, and great jets of flame tab into the thin white smoke.
By the summer of 1943, the radios started arriving. At Stalag Luft 3, Hal Decker was assigned to listen to every word.
I was just in charge of communications to Supreme Allied Headquarters, and I was in the top bunk. My buddy and my helper was in the lower one. And we would get the radio out at night, and I would get under the blanket with a flashlight, and I'd start working with the flashlight and a pad of paper. They would have outlook posts, which they would man while I was working, and prearranged signals for somebody got too close, put that stuff away.
The BBC began each coded message with the sound of a bell. Decker then took down each word. One syllable, a dot. Two syllables, a dash. The BBC was talking to Decker in Morse code. The broadcasts also provided a reassuring voice amidst the uncertainty of war.
The prisoners felt isolated. So to hear anything over the BBC was like a sense of touch, contact. These are voices we understand. And it almost created a sense of comfort into them. Just know that they can reach us even here.
For the Americans at Stalag Luft 3, direct communication with Miss X was crucial as their escape efforts reached a critical stage.
As you know, the Great Escape didn't involve Americans. In the end, the Americans had to leave the campus compound to go to an adjacent. But there was an escape. 76 escaped, 73 were captured, 3 made it. Of the 73 that were captured, 50 of them were executed by Adolf Hitler. But it was part of this amazing program where you can get a sense of the commitment with Miss X, how they tried to reach out and help the prisoners, very similar to what we're going to learn Brian Lippman was doing at the CIA. I end by just explaining something that when I did this film, I got the approval of the CIA and the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency. They were very anxious that I include the last section I'll show you in my script, and they showed me the order that had come from the Department of War. It was from Stimson, and it was a declaration that everything connected to the program was to be destroyed. That becomes relevant in understanding what happened in Vietnam.
April 1945. The Allied powers liberate prisoner of war camps throughout Germany. For Americans at Stalag Luft 3, the dream of freedom had finally come true. The few prisoners who knew of the Miss X project were told to forget everything about it. But not before one returning prisoner tracked down the men at Fort Hunt.
One prisoner of war told us in a briefing that we had with him, said the happiest day of his life was when he knew that the American people had not deserted him.
On August 14th, 1945, following Japanese surrender, the Second World War was over. 6 days later, the Secretary of War, perhaps fearing a debate over possible violations of the Geneva Accords, ordered the history of Miss X to be wiped out.
The word was destroy completely. Repeat, destroy completely.
Being U.S. Army military intelligence, there has to be 6 copies for everything, regardless. So that there was an awful lot of paper. So this took a while.
This was the kind of operation, it's better if you just never talk about it. And if you leave anything behind, it will be talked about. They knew they were on a fine line there, and the best thing to do is to get rid of it.
The men of Miss X took many of their secrets to the grave. But what they did here made a difference. A difference measured not in the numbers brought home, but in the numbers encouraged to fight on for freedom. They overcame daunting obstacles to ensure that prisoners they never knew would realize they had not been forgotten. And in a distant corner of Poland, those who died during the Great Escape are also remembered. Lives lost in pursuit of a dream that lives on.
That is the ending of the film that the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency was very keen that I add. Obviously, the impression, therefore, was that the capability that had been exercised during that period ended, that there was to be no continuation of Miss X. The obvious question I had is, why would you abandon a program which had been so successful in terms of maintaining the morale of the prisoners held in Germany? But I didn't know. Well, fast forward 10 years, and I get a phone call from a POW who wants me to help him go through some files. He's thinking of writing a book. I agree to help him. I go out there, and he's got boxes of all the papers he had from Vietnam during his years of captivity. It's Captain Jerry Coffey. Wonderful man, and he was looking to tell his story. Principally, he wanted to show in the book how he communicated with other prisoners using tap code. Obviously, a very important part of the story I'm about to tell you, but I was already sensing, well, is that all there was? They just communicated with each other. Well, when I was going through the papers, I came across one letter that his wife had written to Commander Robert Burrows of Naval Intelligence. And it was just a small afterthought of a letter. But it said, do you want me to include the coded message at my end or at your end? And the obvious question is that there was an intelligence capability that I didn't know about. He said, look, I can't talk about it, it's classified, but you might want to talk to this man, John Dramisi, a firebrand of a POW who managed to escape once and almost twice from the Hanoi Hilton. I went to see him, and he confirmed that there had been an intelligence connection between the prisoners and Washington and the CIA. But he said, it's classified, I cannot go into details. He went as far as to tell me that it was run by Admiral James Bond Stockdale. But he said, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about the escape plan that almost got me out in 1972. Now, I knew there'd been an escape plan in 1969 at Sante. What was he talking about? Well, he was very keen on telling me, particularly when he started going down the list of capabilities that his plan, hatched in the Hanoi Hilton, required three SR-71s that would be brought in. It would require a submarine under the control of the U.S. Navy and the CIA, and it would involve SEAL Team 1 under the command of Lieutenant Spence Dry. It sounded like an amazing story. Sadly, though, I learned that Spence Dry died during the mission, and the whole thing was classified. Even his father who was in the U.S. Navy, was told his son died in a Navy accident. Now, in Memorial Hall, the important thing to know about Spence Dry is that he was a graduate from the class of 1968 at Annapolis. At Annapolis, in Memorial Hall, they have a wall which names all those who died and the year in which they died. Now, what was interesting is when they put up that wall, they made one startling omission. They didn't include the name of Spence Dry. That became a problem for one of his classmates, Mike Mullen. And the reason why he could get things changed is he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He asked his aide, where is Spence's name? The answer that came back is, well, he died in a classified mission. Classic Mike Mullen, he said, declassify the mission, get his name on the wall. So I met Mike Mullen, explained to him how I was hoping to do a story that would illustrate the sacrifice of Spence Dry, but it made no sense, and I thought would make no sense to the viewer, that you would send all these resources and involve SR-71s into North Vietnamese waters if you weren't able to communicate with the prisoners. How did you know that they planned to escape and where you would find them? And he agreed that that was a problem, but that was outside his scope of authority to release that information. But he wished me well. Into my life comes Bob Wallace. And I called Bob, and we agreed, and we met. And I told him what I knew, little I knew about the program at that point, but again stressed, and it was a good line, that Mike Mullen really would like this film to be made, although it would help me enormously if you thought the CIA would cooperate. I believe it's worrying telling a story when the source is sitting right in front of me, but I believe Bob said that he needed the approval of at least 7 people in the agency, and I had to wait several weeks until finally Bob said that everyone who could object actually was in favor of the program, and I was able to go ahead. And the key thing that I was able to get was the CIA debrief, or the Pentagon debrief. This is the 450-page description of everything that he did from the moment he was captured. But what was crucial about it is it gave me all the information I needed about how he was able to communicate with Washington in a way very similar to those POWs in Salvo III in World War II. I then contacted someone who became a dear friend, and he's also joining me tonight, and that's Admiral Stockdale's son. He was the one who was for years wondering whether his father was alive or dead, had to deal with the reality of losing a father for almost 7 years. I went to visit him at his home. By now I felt I knew a little more about the story, but I also felt it was a story that I could only tell with the authority and approval of the family. Fortunately for me, Jim said that the family actually wanted the story told, but I do remember the moment, which will be forever in my mind, where I'm sitting there on his couch, and he said, well, actually, I have something upstairs that might be of interest to you, and he disappeared, and he came back with a shoebox. Inside the shoebox was Jim Stockdale's debrief, in his own words. So now I had the debrief, I had the tapes of the debrief, and thanks to Bob Wallace and Mike Mullen, I felt I could finally tell the story. So the story was made for the Smithsonian Network, and it was The Spy in the Hanoi Hilton.
May 2nd, 1972. 3 SR-71 spy planes streak high over the jungles of North Vietnam. The aircraft are on a top-secret mission. They are delivering a personal message from President Richard Nixon to Americans being tortured in the infamous Hanoi Hilton prison. At noon, one plane unleashes a sonic boom. Exactly 15 seconds later, there is another. To the American prisoners, the signal confirms that a daring rescue mission, codenamed Operation Thunderhead, is a go.
We have a lot of stuff really highly classified, but that was really highly classified.
Out in North Vietnamese waters, a submarine slips silently into position.
It's a big commitment involving a submarine and a whole lot of fleet assets.
But the rescue attempt is a small part of a clandestine network that for 7 years has linked U.S. intelligence to the men locked inside the horrific dungeons of Hanoi.
This activity is recognized as one of the most significant activities in agency history.
a feat of remarkable spycraft, classified top secret for more than 40 years, and revealed here for the first time. Jim Stockdale's journey from aviator to spy begins on September 9, 1965, a bombing mission into North Vietnam from the carrier USS Oriskany out on the Gulf of Tonkin. To defend South Vietnam, America expands the war into the north, embarking on the most intensive bombing campaign in the history of warfare. The illusion of American invincibility is soon shattered. A Soviet surface-to-air missile brings down Stockdale's A-4 Skyhawk jet. Four days later, he arrives at the infamous Hoa Lo prison, located in the heart of the North Vietnamese capital, Hanoi. The pilots came to nickname it the Hanoi Hilton. Stockdale decides to risk his life to attempt to communicate with U.S. intelligence. The decision is based on his burning desire to expose the cruelty he and his fellow officers experienced inside that prison.
During most of September, I was taken for nearly a month of torture to extract statements. And they carried me into a room to the left. This is room 24.
Room 24. The cell that became synonymous with prolonged torture. After his return, Stockdale describes his experiences to his eldest son, Jim.
The primary form of torture, it had to do with cutting off blood circulation to the upper arms and various parts of the body, and then later, sequentially, to release it. The rush of the blood back into the muscle structure was cause for great pain. It wasn't one and done. It was never finished. They could continue this process for hours, days, sometimes weeks. At one point, Dad said, it got beyond your physical understanding of pain.
In the fall of 1965, Stockdale discovers he hasn't been singled out for abuse. Torture is the norm, inflicted by sadistic guards to extract confessions of alleged war crimes, to force prisoners to violate their oath of loyalty to the United States. Among more than 50 POWs is Navy Commander Jeremiah Denton. Shot down in July 1965, he will become a key player in the espionage operation. Like many others, he is tortured to get him to sign a statement saying the U.S. air war is immoral.
It began with 3 days on top of 2 stools placed one atop the other, and my hands cuffed tightly behind me. No food, no water.
Denton blacks out, loses his balance, and crashes to the concrete floor. But he refuses to sign anything to advance the North Vietnamese propaganda war, refuses to let them win.
Having convinced them that I would not give up by that means, they were going to torture me the following day.
That night, Denton sends a message to Stockdale. He doesn't expect to live through another day.
I gave Jim some instructions, such as what to tell my wife if he ever got home, and I believed that I'd be forgiven a lot of my sins and maybe go straight to heaven.
But Denton survives to continue living in hell. Stockdale concludes the world has to know what is happening inside this prison.
I figured that if there's some way we could let the American people know that we were under pressure, that the press reports that would naturally follow would affect captains dramatically. This was the key to our success.
But how is he going to let the American people know? At survival school, he was taught the art of writing in doublespeak, to conceal vital intelligence in seemingly innocuous text.
This was a time before our magic of modern-day electronics and this kind of communication. So the standard means of exchanging information with spies at the time was through a technique called secret writing.
But that relies on the prison authority allowing Stockdale to write. For 6 months, they refuse. Inside his isolation cell, he knows what to do, but is powerless to do it. A source of frustration for the CIA.
We didn't know at the time, until these communications began, for sure who was alive, who wasn't. Where were you? What were your conditions?
The CIA knows pilots have been trained to communicate, but so far there has been nothing but silence. Then the North Vietnamese make a colossal blunder. 52 pilots are paraded through the streets of Hanoi. Jeering crowds threaten to lynch the pilots as the world's press captures the mayhem. It's a public relations disaster for the North, who relent just a little in the face of international condemnation. Then, in December 1965, after months in isolation, living under a permanent threat of torture, Jim Stockdale is finally allowed to write his first letter home.
My dearest Sib, on this chilly afternoon, I am so glad to be permitted to write my letter and to let you know that I am still okay. One thinks of Vietnam as a tropical country, but in January the rains came and there was cold and darkness even at noon.
Darkness at Noon, a double-speak reference to a well-known novel by Arthur Koestler that vividly depicts atrocities inside Soviet labor camps. The letter takes 4 months to reach Coronado, California. His wife Sybil immediately assumes Jim must be referring to conditions inside the Hanoi Hilton. She contacts the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. Along with the CIA, they are already trying to find a way of communicating with American pilots held in North Vietnam.
There were several areas that were important when the secret writing channel was being considered and then was established. First was the morale of the prisoners. The POWs themselves, did anybody care about us? Well, this confirmed that people really cared about. The second reason had to do with intelligence, with information that we needed from the first-hand experience of the POWs.
Sybil flies to Washington to meet Commander Robert Burrows from Naval Intelligence. The message to her is simple. Is she willing to allow her husband to be recruited as a spy?
Mom took great pause and asked Commander Burrows if any reassurances could be given about Dad's safety as if he was apprehended, exchanging these messages, in essence participating in espionage. And Bob told her he could give no reassurances.
That put Sybil in a near impossible position.
Am I willing to participate in this? Do I have the confidence in the United States government, in the Central Intelligence Agency, to be able to work this in a way that my husband will not be further tortured, you know, maybe even killed? You know, spies get executed.
Spies sent into the field by the CIA have also been taught advanced encryption to enable them to write coded letters. Stockdale has not. Even if Sybil agrees to participate, reaching him inside this prison is going to be a huge challenge. Then, just 2 weeks after Sybil's return from Washington, she sees Jeremiah Denton, Jim's Naval Academy classmate, hauled out to confess his sins. He appears confused and disoriented. But after the broadcast, Naval Intelligence calls Sybil with an explanation. Denton is actually blinking a Morse code message. T-O-R-T-U-R-E. Torture. The appearance convinces Sybil that U.S. intelligence should attempt to recruit Jim as a spy. Now it's up to both the CIA and Naval Intelligence to make that happen. In December 1966, 15 months after being shot down, Jim Stockdale receives his first letter from home.
We have a letter from your wife and a picture of your mother.
They had opened the mail already and said, "We have for you a letter from your wife and a picture of your mother." And in front of everyone in the room, Dad looked at the picture and blurted out,
"This is my mother."
But the confused state prevented anyone from understanding what he was saying, and he was sent back to his cell.
But who is the woman in the photo?
Grandmother Stockdale would never, as the letter suggested, never impulsively fly from her home in Illinois to Coronado, California. And frankly, she was very afraid of seawater and would never wade in the Pacific Ocean.
But for 3 days, he is unable to solve the riddle. What does it mean?
The letter was drafted and designed to try to tell Dad to soak the picture. The operant line was, "I am very lovely when wet." He finally remembered that urine was a good reagent, and he decided to soak the picture in his toilet bucket. After having done so, and again not seeing a message, he tossed it on the concrete and noticed that one of the corners was starting to separate and the picture was starting to come apart. Of course, this was the intention because as he separated the photograph, he was able to read messages and understand what the real intended message was. The message described how the letter that accompanied the photograph was written on special paper.
In his classified intelligence debrief, recorded the week after his return, Jim Stockdale recalls his first message from the CIA.
The note told me the letter was actually written on invisible carbon paper. All future letters bearing an odd date would be on invisible carbon paper. It gave me instructions to write my invisible messages perpendicular to the lines on my letters home. It said to begin coded letters with "darling" and end with "your adoring husband." It warned me to be careful, that if caught, it could lead to espionage charges. And it said to soak any picture with a rose on it, and ended with, "hang on."
With the arrival of the carbon paper, he felt like he could, in fact, influence policy and get messages back to the United States in some form. And he realized that he had transitioned from an aviator in a foreign country to a spy.
For the first time since he was shot down, Stockdale's life has purpose. The note from U.S. intelligence wants the names of American pilots held inside Wallow. Not an easy request. He remains in isolation, and the North Vietnamese don't take roll call. But the prisoners are communicating from cell to cell via tap code. The method, passed from one POW to the next, is designed to allow communication between prisoners held in solitary confinement. The POWs break the alphabet into a grid, 5 across, 5 down. By tapping the row and then the column, the POWs transmit complete sentences. They are fighting back, even if it's just within their cell block.
We could get a question and answer through 69 walls in 24 hours, very sophisticated. It sounded like about 30 secretaries typing away on typewriters. I tapped with guys through the wall that I never saw for 3 years. I knew everything about him, but I never saw his face.
Every night, Red McDaniel taps a G, followed by B, and then a U. God bless you. The tap code facilitates Stockdale's new role as an intelligence officer, pulling his troops together. To compile a complete list, Stockdale also needs a method to link the various cell blocks beyond the reach of tap code. J.J. Cannell is a Navy pilot shot down in July 1966, and for over 2 years, the Vietnamese are convinced he's completely crazy.
He's not that good.
He isn't.
We'll see one is better. I'm telling you.
He pretended to be crazy, and because of that, the enemy had isolated him in a place called the Carriage House, which is next to the coal bin where the coal was. But isolated from the rest of the camp, except daily the other prisoners would go up to the coal bin to have cooking material, and while they did that, they would communicate with JJ.
JJ becomes the communications link between the cell blocks. Stockdale slowly pulls together a list that reaches far beyond anything known in Washington. Names of pilots whose family have already been told their loved one is dead. J.J. Cannell is forced to endure repeated electric shock treatments to restore sanity he never lost. He eventually dies in captivity. The guards suspect Stockdale is responsible for the internal communication and take him out for a special session with the man the POWs simply call Rabbit.
He was given to spontaneous slugging. I remember him particularly for the fact that he was the man that fed me my evening meal, applied the handcuffs daily. I could depend on him to squeeze them down to where there was bone pressure, and I knew that by morning my wrists would be throbbing. At that time I was living solo and blindfolded, cuffed, except for meals.
Stockdale describes the harsh treatment in his next coded letter home. The CIA's Photo Analysis Center extracts the invisible carbon message and passes it along to Commander Robert Burrows at Naval Intelligence, who in turn gives the decoded material to Sybil.
And Mom read the secret message that said hand and leg irons 14 to 16 hours a day, masters at torture. A first real encounter with what Dad was experiencing, and tough for Mom to take and tough for Mom to share.
Those details were contained in the letters which were increasingly coming from Jim Stockdale. This is one of them, and it shows how the CIA would extract the information. The one on the right is the one that's been processed by the CIA. They would go down looking for any indication of a message that's been written by invisible carbon. As the procedure, as they increased the number of letters coming out and other people joined Jim Stockdale's network, one of the things I read in his debrief was he got particular pleasure by discovering that there were some anti-war delegations visiting Hanoi, and that in order to show their concern for prisoners, the prisoners would be told to write letters home so they could give them to the anti-war delegations who were going through Hanoi. And those letters would then be very carefully brought out of Hanoi by these people, never knowing that they actually were destined for the CIA with vital intelligence. But it was still a system he needed to use the invisible carbon. And that became a problem as the North Vietnamese increasingly would go through the cells looking for any evidence of communication. And what happened next was what he was able to do to go beyond simply the secret writing and the encryption and the invisible carbon. When I heard this story, which I'll show you in a moment, it was just an extraordinary ability to memorize. I can't even imagine how he was able to do it, but as you'll learn, he was able to learn a form of encryption code which dramatically increased his ability to communicate with Washington.
Tell me your name.
Under ferocious interrogation, the guards extract more confessions from supposedly repentant American pilots.
I am guilty of crimes against the people, cities, towns, and villages.
Recordings broadcast around the world are piped into the cell blocks housing the POWs. Stockdale is horrified by what he hears and is determined to order the POWs to stay off the air, even if they have to endure torture. He has to get that message to Washington, but he is down to his last page of invisible carbon paper. And guards are heading down the block to conduct a thorough search of his cell. Rather than be caught as a spy, he eats it, leaving him powerless to continue his espionage work for naval intelligence and the CIA. But in December 1967, he makes a crucial discovery that will transform the espionage effort.
Dad discovered that one of his prison mates had been trained in a clandestine cryptography. He was unable to communicate directly with this individual, but he was able to work with the individual, and eventually the person who had been trained extended his foot almost outside of his door, so Dad was able to see his big toe. With his big toe, using Morse code and some other modified methods, over a period of 4 or 5 days, the prisoner who had been trained taught Dad this cryptographic code.
The code is committed to memory. Nothing is ever written down. From now on, every letter he sends Sybil contains sophisticated CIA code. Having established a communications link with Washington, Taps on the walls turn increasingly to the possibility of escape. In early 1969, John Dramisi and Ed Atterbury climb over the wall of a prison to the west of Wallow. Recaptured 12 hours later, they are both severely punished. Atterbury is tortured to death. Guards go in search of collaborators, eventually focusing on Lieutenant Commander Red McDaniel.
They stripped me down, spread eagle on the floor, and started out with a fan belt. Have a guy on one side, a guy on the other side, and they'd start in the back and work down through the legs.
During the brutal session, McDaniel's elbow is shattered.
The bone was protruding through the skin. It didn't stop them. They would try to push it back in, just physically. But they continued the torture for another, it went a total of 14 days, and the arm was broken about the third or fourth day, I believe. And I had nothing else left to give, and I made a total surrender.
Surrender to his God, a source of strength when all else seems lost.
But I learned a lesson. I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is simply the presence of faith.
Faith that has to sustain Red for a further 3 long years.
Now, I got to know Red McDaniel initially in 1984 when I was doing a BBC program on missing in action. But he became someone who was a close friend of mine. He stayed in Vietnam until 1973 when he came back with Jim Stockdale. But unlike many, he stayed in the Navy. He became ultimately the captain of the USS Lexington. And he was hoping to be here tonight. I spoke to him yesterday. He's 95 years old. He unfortunately had a fall recently and felt to be unable to come. He's no doubt watching me and no doubt will be phoning in if I've made any mistakes. But he's an amazing American hero, and I was proud to get to know him and call him my friend. He also knew and participated in Jim Stockdale's program. What I'm now wanting to talk about is one of the things that I read in the debrief, which forever was a source of anxiety, because he knew, Jim Stockdale, what could happen to a human being when they go through the kind of torture that the prisoners heard when they read what had happened to Red McDaniel. The scene you've just seen was described later as the most severe torture ever inflicted on a prisoner in Hanoi. Now, Jim Stockdale knew that that had happened to Red McDaniel, it could happen to him. And his great concern was not necessarily the infliction of pain, but rather what he might tell the North Vietnamese that they would be able to use against American interest. And that dated not from his capture and his time as a POW, but it actually came all the way back to 1964 and a particular event that was central to his life, an event which caused him to agonize over the implication of being a witness to what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Years after he died, I was able to do a film for the BBC about the Gulf of Tonkin. I show you these clips not because it's necessarily important to our story to know what happened and what didn't happen out in the Gulf of Tonkin. The important thing here is because Jim Stockdale felt that he had observed an administration using deception to initiate a war, that we had gone into that war under false pretenses. Had that been known to the North Vietnamese, it would have been devastating. He was petrified that they would get the information out of him. This was how I started my story, Playing with the Truth, which I hope explains some of the ordeal that he must have had sitting there in Hanoi.
This is a propaganda film purporting to show a U.S. naval destroyer defending itself against an unprovoked attack by communist torpedo boats off the coast of North Vietnam. It's a reconstruction of what became known as the Tonkin Gulf incident, President Johnson's justification for his momentous decision in 1964 to bomb North Vietnam for the first time. But the film was never released because the story it told was untrue. The true story of that decision is different, a story of deliberate deception of Congress and the people by the Johnson administration.
We were heading to war, and you better level with Congress when you're going to war. And I would have thought that Congress would have insisted that people level with the United States people. Oh, certainly. I think it was a terrible mistake.
At the heart of the story are recordings of phone calls made at the time by President Johnson himself and now released after more than 30 years. We have recreated many of the scenes that follow, but the words you'll hear are real.
This boy, our friend Hubert, is just destroying himself with his big mouth. He just got to understand that you can't talk about war plans, and he just ought to keep his goddamn big mouth shut on foreign affairs, at least until the election's over.
Jim Stockdale feared that he wouldn't be able to keep his damn mouth shut, that under torture he would reveal what he saw on the evening of August the 4th, 1964. At that point, he was stationed on the USS Constellation. He was the wing commander. He was the one in charge of all the planes that were sent out initially to try and find the Norfolk Mees who were attacking American vessels, the Turner Joy and the Maddox. But then he was the wing commander who launched the first major attack on North Vietnam the next day for an event he almost certainly believed had not happened. So in the film, I interviewed a POW colleague, someone who suffered through Hanoi with Jim Stockdale, Everett Alvarez. Everett Alvarez, who became part of the communication network, was with Jim Stockdale on the night of August the 4th when they were sent out to try and find the North Vietnamese air vessels.
Out in the Tonkin Gulf, it was a dirty night. On the two destroyers, all hands were on edge.
As we headed out at the Gulf at a high speed through this heavy sea state and the storm, we started to pick up numerous radar contacts, reported at various speeds, different bearings. There were numerous ones. I can't remember exactly how many there were, but there were numerous contacts. The data was coming at us so quickly that it became almost impossible to interpret at that point what was happening.
At his desk at the Pentagon, McNamara was getting ready to retaliate before a single shot had been fired.
Secretary McNamara calling, line O.
Hello? Yeah. Mr. President, we have ample forces to respond not only to these attacks on the destroyers, but also to retaliate should you wish to do so. 70% of the petroleum supply of North Vietnam, we believe, is concentrated in 3 dumps, and we can bomb or strafe those dumps, destroy the petroleum system. In addition, there are certain prestige targets that we've been working on the last several months, and we have target folders prepared on those. For example, there is one bridge that is the key bridge on the rail line south out of Hanoi, and we could destroy that. And there are other prestige targets of that kind.
Just before 11 o'clock, nighttime in the Gulf, morning in Washington, McNamara received news from the front.
We just had a report from the commander of that task force out there that they have sighted 2 unidentified vessels and 3 unidentified prop aircraft. And therefore, the carrier launched 8 aircraft to examine what's in the vicinity of the destroyers and to protect the destroyers.
It was a dark night. There was no moon, and we were flying 3 aircraft in our flight. We were flying without any lights. Of course, we did not want to be seen or detected. As we approached the target, we heard all this commotion on the frequencies of the destroyers. It was sort of high-pitched, calling out this, calling out that, excited voices.
Panic set in.
You have people shouting, "We've got a PT boat bearing, 230-090," and then the next thing you start to hear is torpedoes in the water.
Opposite the deck, torpedo passing close aboard to starboard side.
Aye. Another torpedo passing close aboard, port side.
We fired numerous rounds at these PT boats that were being reported to us, zigzagging to trying to avoid the torpedoes. And after a while, we had so many torpedoes in the water, it became unbelievable that we could have that many torpedoes in the water. but it was a frightening time. You're dealing with a crew, a little sleep, fatigued, tired, and now this in the middle of the night. So it was a time when people were panicking.
When he returned after the mission, having seen no Norfolk Meade's action at all, he reported to the Admiral that there had been nothing out there. They had been shooting at whales, was his response. He then strongly recommended that they do not launch an attack on North Vietnam based on the evidence that they had seen, which basically that there had been no attack on the Maddox and the Turner Joy. And he and Everett Alvarez left their base and went to their quarters, convinced that there would be no retaliation, because why retaliate if you hadn't been attacked? The next morning, he was to lead the raid on North Vietnam. It was a raid which led to the shooting down of Everett Alvarez, and a year later, Jim Stockdale was to join him inside the Hanoi Hilton. Knowing that, it was obviously of great concern to Jim Stockdale that under torture he would reveal what he saw, or more importantly, what he had not seen on the night of August the 4th, 1964. You may know, as was said at the beginning, that he was to be awarded the Medal of Honor, in part for the event which is about to be shown. It was an event which was designed to ensure that he didn't reveal under torture two specific things. One was the communication to Washington, and the second thing he didn't want revealed was what had happened out on the Gulf of Tonkin. And what he did to prevent him being used for propaganda was in part to result in him being awarded the Medal of Honor.
In January 1969, Jim Stockdale is about to go through the worst of times. The guards still want a confession and intend to break him unless they get one.
I was taken over to the Navi room for nearly a month of torture.
North Vietnamese guards inflict what is by now a familiar torture. They pull Stockdale's arms back over his shoulders for hours at a time. He becomes delirious, will say anything to stop the pain, even if it means disloyalty. But the guards want more. They want to take him downtown to commit treason before television cameras. They need him to look presentable and tell him to take a shower to wash away the stain of sustained torture.
He takes the soap and soaps his face a little bit, but then proceeds to soap up. And having done so, he takes the crude razor and begins to cut his scalp. It was not so much the absence of hair as it was the blood coming down into his eyes and on his face. This technique of self-disfigurement in order to prevent his being exposed to cameras or foreign dignitaries or journalists.
Stockdale then grabs a wooden stool and batters his own face to ensure he is unsuitable for the cameras.
And the guards rushed in and screamed at Dad, "What will I tell the commander?" Dad said, "You tell him that the captain will not be going downtown."
An encounter that led James Bond Stockdale to be awarded the Medal of Honor.
That was in 1969, and at that point the communication with Washington was beginning to suggest to Washington that they might actually be able to find a camp where they could land and free the prisoners. They're told in coded messages that there is a camp at Sante and that it appeared to be poorly guarded and that there was a chance that they could have a rescue mission. The rescue mission was a spectacular failure in as much as it was an amazingly well-orchestrated raid, but the prisoners had already left. But this is the story of what the consequences of that raid were. And one of the things that I found interesting looking at the debrief is that their warning about the prisoners being at Sante, the prisoners themselves had sent a coded note to Washington telling them that they'd moved, that they were no longer at Sante. But unfortunately, there were now so many letters coming in to the CIA to be analyzed that the letter telling them that they had moved was sitting on the desk on the day that the mission was executed. So this was the beginning of a major effort from the CIA. Brian Lipman, who we'll learn more about now, was able to take over the running of this program because it's about to significantly escalate from being coded letters to the kind of possibility that led to at least the possibility of a rescue mission.
The Pentagon notifies Stockdale through coded letters that it's open to the idea of launching a rescue mission inside North Vietnam, but they need help.
If you are planning such kind of operations, again, we needed to know information of where you were, how many there were, lots of factors before you could mount any kind of reasonable rescue attempt.
By December 1969, that seems a real possibility. 61 prisoners are moved to Sante, and some of them know the encryption code. It is a remote camp 23 miles to the west of Hanoi, and the POWs suspect the isolation of the camp makes it vulnerable.
We arrived at Sante in several groups. All of the people who were there had been in the system before, so we knew how to communicate. There was a discussion early about where we were. There's a mountain. We knew the height of that mountain. We could determine the direction of that mountain, and from triangulation, we could give a rough estimate of how far we were from that mountain and what direction it was. And we wanted that word to get out.
Nixon orders a rescue mission so secret that the special forces who trained for 9 months don't know their intended target. Don't know, that is, until they enter North Vietnamese airspace. On the night of November 21st, 1970, for the first time in the war, America is going after its POWs to bring them home. The mission to free American POWs approaches the prison at Sante. 61 prisoners are believed to be inside the camp. One inmate is Danny Glenn, who hears the helicopters coming.
We were awakened by bombs going off, SAMs being fired, AAA fire. We don't know what it's about, but we're all sitting there cheering, shaking our fists, jumping up and down, and going crazy.
The only problem is that Danny Glenn isn't at Sante. 4 months earlier, POWs had sent a coded message saying they had moved, but because of a backlog of letters, this isn't decoded by the U.S. intelligence until the day of the raid. That night, the POWs are 15 miles from freedom. Critics in Washington immediately deride it as a spectacular failure. That is not how the prisoners saw it.
Sending the message that we had not given up, I can't imagine that not being one of incredible rejuvenation for anybody in those circumstances.
The Sante raid sends a very clear message to the North Vietnamese. Their remote prison camps are vulnerable. All POWs are brought back to Hanoi and moved into what becomes known as Camp Unity, a sealed compound inside the walls of Hoa Lo.
When we moved back into Hanoi, they moved us into a large room, and there were 59 people in the room, which we thought was fantastic. Over the next few days, we had communications with everyone who had been shot down up to that point, something over 350 prisoners.
Finally out of isolation, Jim Stockdale dramatically expands the covert writing program. The principle is clear. The more correspondence sent out, the better the chance the message will get through.
Well, I was not trained in covert communications, but some of my cellmates were, and from them, they taught us. We did that as a lifeline, and so we knew, the U.S. knew what was happening in that camp.
Stockdale calls the covert network the Hanoi Saloon. His code name is the Bartender. His principal deputy is the Master Communicator, codenamed Martini. He mixes up the message before sending sections to his team of writers.
80% of the prison population were part of the network I led. We assigned parts of messages to the writers inside the cell blocks. No one, other than the Master Communicator and myself, had the complete message.
Every message is memorized, translated into encryption code, and then written down.
In the end, they developed messages that would go out in waves, and 5 of the writers would write a version of the first part of the message. Another 5 writers would write their version of a second part of the message, so you would wind up sending home a series of sequenced letters that contained different messages that came and could be used as a whole.
So a program that started with a single Polaroid picture is about to move into high gear. In the spring of 1971, the CIA's Office of Technical Service offers to smuggle into Hanoi spy paraphernalia that will enhance Stockdale's capabilities. Robert Wallace, the division's former director, knows the man who led the effort, who is known by the cover name of Brian Lipman.
Brian Lipman was a CIA officer serving undercover. He was an officer who had both the capability and the discipline to do the kind of work that is work after hours when nobody else was around, so as to keep the communications operation with the POWs as secret as possible.
As humanitarian packages start to get through, it presents Brian Lipman and the CIA an almost endless set of possibilities. The agency smuggles 4 miniature radios into the camp, all hidden in tubes of toothpaste. The radios are small enough to fit into a prisoner's ear, and the most prized contraband of all is an encoded microdot.
Think about the microdot in terms of the size of a period on a piece of paper. That period could contain as much as a full sheet of information, 200, 300 words.
They are hidden inside packets of Kool-Aid, all visible through a tiny Stanhope lens.
This is an example of the Stanhope lens. The microdot then could be placed on one end of the lens. A microdot could be read.
Minute encrypted messages arrive. Some show a series of coded numbers to be deciphered by those taught CIA encryption. These lenses are a vital part of the clandestine network.
I was in charge of the microdot program. That program was our most closely guarded secret. No one ever gave it up. As far as I know, there was no compromise of the microdot program. The Vietnamese never knew.
From the agency perspective, this activity is recognized as one of the most significant activities in agency history.
Bob Wallace was explaining to me how this became such an important part of the Office of Technical Service as they were responding to the opportunity of smuggling things into the camp. It reminded me so much of the challenges that were faced by the people at Miss X back in World War II. I had no idea who Brian Lipman was, but it was clear that he was central to this story. Without him, there would have been nothing to actually send out there, nothing that they could have hidden. It was all part of his effort. For me, he was just a man in the shadows. One of the great things about being able to come back and revisit the story is that at the end of the program, and we're very near the end now, you will actually learn who he was. For me, he was just someone who had a code name. I was ultimately able to talk to his family members and learn that they had no idea what he was doing for many years. And it was the nature of his job that there had to be complete confidentiality even within the agency. But by the end of the evening, you will at least know who Brian Lipman was. We're now getting towards the end, and again, the opportunity leads to the thought that we're going to escape. As I told you originally when I talked to John Dramisi, and he outlined a very elaborate scheme for getting prisoners out of Hanoi in 1972, that I realized that that was actually potentially a tremendously important story. And why was it that I'd never heard of it before? It was literally classified top secret until basically we were able to tell this story. So this is the story of what we became known as Operation Thunderhead in May of 1972, when there was a definite effort to get 2 prisoners out of that prison and allow them to be brought to Washington. And the plan for the Nixon administration was they were going to be shown at a joint session of Congress. Sadly, it didn't quite happen that way.
An encrypted message is sent outlining how prisoners intend to escape Wallow. make it to the Red River, and then swim or commandeer a boat to sail 92 miles east to the open waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. There, the POWs want Navy SEALs to pick them up and carry them to safety. The encrypted message is delivered to the desk of Admiral Thomas Moore, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Mike Mullen knows what he would have done next.
As the chairman myself, I want to talk to the leadership that's going to essentially execute this mission. I want to understand what the risks are, what the probabilities are. And the first individual I would go see would be the Secretary of Defense and lay out everything I knew about it. And then we would either agree or disagree that we need to take this to the President of the United States.
And that is what happens. Richard Nixon is preparing for his re-election campaign in 1972. He immediately understands the huge boost he'd receive if he introduces a liberated American prisoner to a joint session of Congress. The president orders a submarine to enter North Vietnamese waters and stand ready to liberate POWs sailing down the Red River. It's the most daring Navy SEAL mission of the war and remains secret for 35 years. May 1972. The USS Grayback sets sail from Subic Bay in the Philippines. The boat is under the control of Navy Captain John Chamberlain. Its mission, to rescue American prisoners escaping from a North Vietnamese prison, is directed by the CIA. On board, SEAL Team 1's Alpha Platoon under the leadership of Lieutenant Spence Dry. The mission calls for many subs to transport the SEALs to an island a mile off the North Vietnamese coast to intercept escaping American prisoners of war. Inside the Hanoi Hilton, the prisoners have no idea the rescue mission has been approved. Their coded message to Washington asked for an unmistakable signal from the heavens to show that President Nixon supports the escape plan. On May 2nd, it's delivered by 3 SR-71s flying close to the sound barrier as they approach Hanoi.
The signal that was sent was an expression that the National Command Authority of the United States of America would stand by its POWs and attempt to rescue them. That was a powerful message.
That emphatic signal presents a huge problem for the senior American officers inside the prison. They never imagined the mission would be approved, never thought they'd have to decide whether Dramisi should be allowed to escape. Some thought he should try. Some have a very different judgment, born of experience.
I have respect for John Dramisi, a real firebrand, tough guy. But from my vantage point, it was almost impossible to escape from that system and make it to the coast.
Dramisi insists he has to at least try. Meanwhile, the USS Grayback sails on. June 3rd, 1972, it reaches its position off the coast of North Vietnam. On board is Navy SEAL Moki Martin.
We launched the SDV, and for about 2.5 or 3 hours, the SDV's moving and moving and moving.
The currents and tides are a huge challenge.
Everybody is on phones. You could hear what everybody is saying. And I think the pilot started to say, I'm losing power. We're running battery power down.
The SEALs must abort and are picked up by helicopter and transported to the cruiser USS Long Beach.
When we were on the USS Long Beach, it was really important that we get back to the Grayback and tell them about the currents.
John Wilson is part of the helicopter crew that volunteers for the top-secret mission, and that night he heads out to return the SEALs to the Grayback.
And they indicated that they were going to do an open ocean drop, and that they needed to be able to get down to 20 feet, 20 knots maximum.
But in the sheer blackness of the night, the chopper struggles to get into position. Whatever the risks, team leader Spence Dry is determined to complete the mission.
I'm with you, swim buddy. You go and I'll follow you out the door.
And we made the approach, and the word came over the intercom, put the swimmers out, drop, drop, drop.
You know, there's always these feelings that some of the guys, or some of the guys in platoon said they'll follow him into hell. I think I did.
All 4 men jumped out the door, and it was pitch black. You couldn't see anything.
The minute I cleared the door, I did my mental count in my head, and I counted 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. I goes, damn it.
The helicopter is much too high.
And I hit the water.
The 4 SEALs slam into the water like it's concrete. 2 SEALs suffer minor injuries, but a third, the team leader Spence Dry, breaks his back and dies on impact.
I flipped him over, and in the moonlight I could see he had blood coming out of his nose, and I was shocked. All we're trying to do is do this operation, and we just ran into things that was really out of our control.
Yet despite the setback, Operation Thunderhead continues to monitor North Vietnamese waters for a further 3 days, waiting for prisoners who never appear. What the SEALs don't know is that inside the Hanoi Hilton, the POW leadership has finally made a crucial decision. They fear that if they allow an escape attempt, a brutal purge of remaining prisoners is sure to follow.
In light of that, we all hope it didn't go, and the leadership said no.
A decision that remains controversial even today, but endorsed by a commander who faced similar tough choices.
Or the leaders on the ground, the individuals in the situation, they have to, as best they can, use their judgment, and I would never question that.
But thankfully, the Vietnam War is finally drawing to a close. In December 1972, Nixon orders one final aerial onslaught to force the North to accept his peace terms.
Stand by to release. Ready now. Tom's going.
As bombs rain down on Hanoi, the communists claim American POWs inside Hoa Lo have been killed. But the prisoners have the final word. By now, a miniature transmitter has been smuggled into the camp. A Morse code message is sent out that reads, "Vietnamese lie, we're okay." It reaches the White House within hours. Reinvigorated, Nixon orders the bombing to continue. Finally, in January 1973, the North accepts Nixon's conditions. It brings to an end U.S. involvement in a bitterly divisive war. The prisoners return home, grateful for clandestine assistance they are told they can never discuss.
Knowing that we were able to contact the U.S. government and we could get our story out, and that someday they were going to come to get us, and that kept us going from day to day. That little hope, believing that tomorrow's going to be better than today.
Jim Stockdale is on the first flight home.
Jim? Yes? Oh, I love you, Jim. Are you all right?
Yes, I am. I'm in very, very good health. I love you so, and I'm so proud of you all, and I've heard so many things about what you've been doing and how active you've been.
Active in a program that remained classified for decades. Only today can the risks taken by the prisoners be fully understood without jeopardizing current operations.
Secrets have a half-life, sort of like radioactivity. And some secrets have a half-life of a minute. Some secrets have a half-life of 100 years. I think the half-life of the information we've talked about today, that's been neutralized. It's no longer radioactive.
An operation led by Stockdale and witnessed by those who went through hell and returned to tell their stories.
I first became aware of the respect in which other men held him. At Balboa Naval Hospital, I would occasionally walk with some of his colleagues. When I was introduced to them, they were very thoughtful, and they would look, step back, look me up and down, and sometimes say things like, "Your father is the greatest leader of men I've ever known." That alone would give me some sense of the depth of the loyalty of the men he had led through what they would later call less than ideal conditions.
I'm sorry that we missed the final thought there, but what I talked about at the very end is the significance of Jim Stockdale's program, what it meant to the people that he led in the Hanoi Hilton. There was a story that I learned from Moki Martin, which seems to be a nice way to end before I bring up the guests. I was talking to Moki Martin after the interview, and he said, no one ever thanked me for that mission. No one ever talked about it. I was told I couldn't talk to anybody about what happened out there in the Gulf of Tonkin. He said, years later, I was at a football game in the high school in Coronado watching my son play. The bleachers were full, and I looked down the bleachers, and there was someone walking towards me down the bleachers, making his way, and I suddenly realized it was Jim Stockdale. And he walked all the way down the aisle, the bleacher, came and sat right next to me. And he put his arm around me, and he said, all of us know what you did for us. And I just want you to know that we thank you. And that was, he said, the first and only time anyone in the U.S. military had thanked him for what happened out in the Gulf of Tonkin. So now, if you remember the 1992 debate with Jim Stockdale's famous lines, "Who am I?" Well, at least now you'll be able to tell anybody the rest of the story. So thank you very much for watching the clips, and I want to introduce my two guests who can, Jim Stockdale, whose father you got to know in the course of the film, Jim, who is a school superintendent, but also someone who spent a year from school to help his father prepare for the debrief, and then a book that he almost wrote, and you'll discover why he didn't. And then Bob Wallace, whose support was so overwhelming, I couldn't have made this film without the support of the agency. And it was Bob Wallace who went in there to bat for me. His view, and I hope your view, is that the story that these people did, the courage that they showed, that people deserve to know. And so my effort tonight was to try and tell that story. So the two of them can come up and help me answer any of your questions. I did want to pose one question. I hinted at the beginning that Brian Littman, who was so important to the story, he was the guy that you met, in a sense. His character was the guy at Fort Hunt, Virginia, trying to come up with things that would allow them to ship the devices, escape devices, to those prisoners. And it was Brian Littman who had that job. And as I mentioned, I had no idea who Brian was. But after the program went out, I understand that there was a change of heart at the CIA. And so I was going to ask you, Bob, you were there, you pitched for the country to know who Brian Littman was, and how were you able to discover who he was? And we will name him this evening.
Brian Littman's name in the book that Keith Melton and I co-authored called Spycraft. You will recognize Keith Melton's name as instrumental in getting this spy museum up and running. Keith and I, in working on the book, wanted to tell this particular story because Brian Littman, who we gave that name to, was David Coffey. David Coffey was a senior officer in the Office of Technical Service. He was a chemist by education, so he had secret writing, chemistry of secret writing, as part of his portfolio. When he was asked to work with the Navy, particularly Commander Burroughs, on this particular project, the significance of David Coffey's work was recognized in 1997 when the CIA, in celebrating its 50th anniversary, nominated 50 individuals, or named 50 individuals, as CIA trailblazers. Now, this is 1997. The program had not yet been officially acknowledged. So one of the requirements to be a trailblazer was that you had to have your true name revealed, because we were going to make this public. So let me read you David Coffey's public statement on David Coffey as a trailblazer. Mr. Coffey's exceptional ability to solve operational problems with technology culminated in his successful creation and maintenance of an extremely sensitive covert communications capability. His leadership significantly enhanced the integration of technical support into espionage operations. Now you know the rest of the story. Isn't that terrific governmental writing? Well, fortunately, 10 years later, we were able to tell the story and officially recognize David. Now, one other point I would make, you mentioned Jerry Coffey.
Mm-hmm.
And your introductory remarks, David. David Coffey and Jerry Coffey are not related. The last names are spelled differently.
Right, that's right. I did, when I was doing the research on the story, I understood why I wasn't able to find out who Brian Lipman was, but why was it so essential that he worked late at night? He couldn't actually tell his own colleagues in the technical service office what he was doing. Why is it so important that even within the agency, you couldn't discuss this?
It would not be uncommon for the agency to compartment an operation like this. One of the reasons for the compartmentation is that while CIA's contribution is really highlighted in the film, this was indeed a fully integrated, cooperative, cross-agency program. So selected individuals from the National Security Agency, the CIA, the Navy intelligence were integrated into this activity, but the numbers of folks that were briefed on it were by order of the Navy to be kept at the absolute minimum. David Coffey's immediate superior, for example, in the Office of Technical Service, the manager of his unit, was not aware of what David was doing. He just knew that he showed up at odd hours often.
I'd like to just ask Jim Stockdale here a question. Not only was his father learning to become a spy, doing the encryption, and that I found remarkable, that you could actually learn encryption by just watching someone's big toe. That astonishes me. But not only was Jim Stockdale becoming a spy, but your mother was becoming a spy. Tell me how she was roped in, not only allowing Jim to send coded messages, but was willing to send encrypted messages herself.
This was I'm just the cub reporter in this operation. I grew up in the household where a lot of it unfolded. And as I mentioned, Bob, earlier, in those days, you could get away with a lot of things that you likely in no way can get away with now. When Mom was first approached by Bob Burrows about covertly communicating with Dad, Mom took it upon herself to say to me that probability was possible. And surprising to even me, she said, "What do you think of that idea?" And I said, "Well, it seems to me that's the only way. If we were going to fight back, we'd better take every opportunity." And I enjoyed a confidence with Mom and later many confidences with Dad about that. But as a kid growing up, you've got to have a different viewpoint on all of what's going on, and it required incredible dedication and the courage of the men that implemented those programs, the kindnesses. And every one of those faces you saw, I know those guys. And I've been to several of their funerals and enjoyed meeting their families over the years. And they're an incredible group of men who really did a wonderful service to the country in many ways. I also mentioned, David, that there's a bureaucratic lesson in some of this, and it's difficult, but as David wove into the fabric of his narrative, the night of August 4th, 1964 was a very difficult night, and I took I did some research work and found out that Dad's plane captain that night was a guy named Charlie Patton. And when Dad came back to the ship, he had to go out solo because the guy who he's supposed to go out with, his electronics failed as soon as he left the ship. But Dad was out there for 2.5 hours flying, sweat soaking through his flight suit, listening to the radio chatter on the ground. He never once saw any PT boat out there. And later, the Desron commander, the commander of the destroyers there, at 2:30 that morning, radioed to Washington. At this point, it looks as though we have no real sightings of any harassment or anything like that by PT boats, and recommend caution prior to further action. Dad got out of his plane that night, and Charlie Patton and his electrician's mate, Phil Morrison, reported that they'd never seen Dad so mad. He was just so pissed off. He'd been out there flying around, and he literally tossed his helmet at Phil at one point, and he said, "Not one goddamn wake, not one boat, not one thing out there." And he went down to the ready room and made sure that the fellas knew to get his message to Washington that night, in addition to the Desron commanders. Here's the sad part. The bureaucracy in Washington had already decided what they wanted to believe had happened that night. And 4 or 5 days later, 2 guys came out from the Pentagon, a fellow named Friedman, and a couple of Robert McNamara's adjutants. And one of them was kind of a flamboyant fellow, and he said, Dad described I remember it so vividly. He said he came into the cabin, he said, "Well, I knew something was up the other day. I was out at Nag's Head with the family, and I saw the black sedan in the driveway coming back up from the beach, and we all got all packed up and came out here. We've spent 4 days coming out here to ask you just one question. Were there any fucking boats out there or not?" And both Dad and Wes McDonald said, "No boats." And Dad,
was I correct in suggesting that that was a major concern that he had?
Oh, yes.
That he was going to be tortured into admitting what he knew.
If they knew, if they knew what you knew, in spite of all the courage in the world, they were going to get that out of you. I mean, so he hid that fact from the Vietnamese, dear to his life, because he didn't want that as consummately contradictory as it was. He didn't want that to imperil the lives of other prisoners or men who were at that point in the field. And Dad wrapped it up by saying, "I could have written the whole testimonial to that war that night in that cabin when those guys asked me that question." He said there were the back out, the guilt trip that the bureaucrats would go through, the Bundys, the different advisors to Robert McNamara and others. He said the slow back out, the kind of ducking of the head and the different bureaucratic feints, he said, and an entire generation of Americans would get left holding the bag. And that is, in fact, what happened. But you have to understand there was irony in all of that. And it's I throw it in just because that haunting tale repeats itself over and over again in our history. And at a time when we're on the precipice of committing so many young lives to a cause we don't have enough explanation about, in my opinion, to commit their lives to, I just want you to know that does happen. It happens more often than we know. And I would ask that if anyone is in any power to have any precaution thrown into the conversation, please shield us from that and do the right thing, but make sure it's the right thing for the right reason. Sorry to get into a testimonial about it, but that was part of the family legacy that Dad wanted to be shared out long after he was gone.
David, I have a question for Jim about that family legacy. Brian Lippman or David Coffey was part of the Office of Technical Service at CIA. The Office of Technical Service at CIA is the Q of America, for those of you who are James Bond fans. So my question is, family legacy, 40 years before the first James Bond movie, your father was named James Bond.
Right.
Why?
Well, that's my father's mother's name was Mabel Bond, and her married name was Stockdale. But Mabel Bond, she fancied it a very prestigious family in central Illinois farming community, and she was very proud of that. So Dad was named James Bond Stockdale. It's a family name, and I can't tell you how many times I've explained that to everybody from
Yeah, but
hotel
Jim,
hotel people to the police officers. You draw out your ID and they just kind of laugh and they say, "Oh, come on."
Now, there was, though, one line from the debrief that I was going to include in the script, but I thought it's so hokey, no one will believe it. He's deciding what to do with the photograph, and he's been looking at it for 3 days, and he hasn't worked it out. And he's lying according to his own debrief, thinking, well, I'm James Bond, what would he do? And I thought, well, if I wrote that in the script, the network would cross it out. So, but anyway, he certainly saw significance.
Yeah.
Now, Bob, from your point of view, obviously you said kindly for me, because when you said it, I was thrilled, that secrets have half-lives. How do you respond to those who say, well, we still have the possibility of prisoners being captured and held abroad? Should we even be making films like this?
Yes, indeed. We do have prisoners captured abroad, and I was very pleased to see that in the recent rescue of the pilot in Iran, the CIA maybe had a role in that with the communications, and I thought, well, that's a very nice continuation of this story. Much of intelligence is like football, and that is, in football, there are three things that you can do. You can pass, you can kick, or you can run, and that's about it. The trick of you win in football because of how you execute, and many of these techniques that we talked about or that were used in the story, these were in fact techniques that were well known. The concept of the technique itself, and Miss X was the kind of model of doing that. The British had a similar activity. So it's really in the execution of the activity that is secret, and those do remain secret at the time that we are running the play or executing it. So that's a way I have approached this. I will add this one caveat: there are others who disagree with me, and they believe that activities of the intelligence community should be protected indefinitely, and that's an interesting philosophical debate.
And for those of you who may be more interested in what went into the story, I was actually asked with Gordon Peterson, who appeared in the program, who was the one largely instrumental in getting the information on Spence Dry, getting his name on the wall. He was a Navy captain. He and I wrote an article for the CIA, which is in their Studies of Intelligence. And it sort of tells you everything that I knew at the time, and with Gordon's help, he knew way more than I did. But at least allows you to see how much information was actually released by the CIA, because they had actually asked me to write it, and then they went ahead and published it. So if you go to the Studies of Intelligence and just type Gordon Peterson or my name, this article, it's about 19 pages, comes up and does tell you a little more detail about what happened in Thunderhead and how it was part of a broader picture. Are there any specific questions in the time we have left?
Really have some online, and I don't want to scare anybody in the audience away by me being over here, but I'm going to ask some of these. But if anybody wants to join me here, I will step aside. But one that came in very early was, how many prisoners of war that came home from the Vietnam War are still living?
Those records are kept very close, and there's one of the prisoners himself is Very, very close. I'm going to say about 225. And I get notifications in my email, and there are more and more. There's a kind of a dialogue online, NOTAMs they're called, and many of these folks are passing away as time goes by, and that community of prisoners grew into a very robust community of helpers one to another. But there are about 225 still remaining alive. Let me name one who is, and I want you to know the fellow who communicated with his big toe, and he's probably going to be very pissed off that I tell who he is, but his name was Bob Shoemaker. Bob is 95 and he lives in Virginia, and he's a remarkable guy. He was pulled out of squadron activities as a JG and sent to a special school as a very young man to learn a code they call CSSP, which was one of the very highly confidential, and he was able to share that with Dad by his toe, and he is a very courageous and capable man who seldom gets the credit, mainly by his modesty, but otherwise by the fact that other people may have more respect for his wishes than I do. But I always want to credit Bob, because the trail is getting long and the life yet to be lived is getting short. He needs to know how much we loved him.
I have something to add here, which is slightly off point, but it's something I felt very strongly doing this film. We talk about, tragically, these people are getting older, they are dying. What amazed me was the discovery that I was able to get Jim Stockdale's debrief, because it had been given to his family in the 1980s when he was in charge of the Naval War College in Rhode Island. What I didn't realize until afterwards, that in an act of Congress passed in 1992, every single POW's debrief is classified in perpetuity and is only available to the POWs one time for 2 days. They cannot read, they can't take notes, they can't copy them. And once they've been there for 2 days and they've read their debrief, it is then refiled. And I mentioned this to Mike Mullen, and I said, can you think of anything else in the US government that is classified in perpetuity? And I'm told that this was a result of an amendment to the 1992 Defense Act. It may have changed, but certainly when I was talking to Mike Mullen and we looked into it, it was an issue that Red McDaniel, who sadly can't be with us to tell us, he explains what it was like sitting there for 2 days and having to sign something saying that was the last time he was allowed to see his own debrief. It seems remarkable. It certainly seems to me that if these prisoners do die at some point, one would like to hope you can read their debriefs, because they are amazing people.
Dad left me boxes.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. This has been alluded to a little bit, but Bob, maybe you can circle back more clearly on, could you say more about why this operation was considered to have such a long half-life compared to others? Is the concern that knowing POWs can be used as spies might influence adversaries to treat POWs worse in future conflicts? Is that part of it?
If that question was directed to me, no, and I'm not going, would not prejudge or judge the decision on that. I think this the matter of declassification in a democratic society is a good reason for the Spy Museum to exist, because it raises this question. It just people being here and seeing as well. Why do we know about this and not about this? These kinds of decisions are not entirely black and white. We don't know what the content of all of those debriefings might be. And people change their mind over time.
All right. I have one final question. And actually, two people ask it in different ways. So, regarding the Miss X program, why were all the artifacts associated with the program destroyed? Was it a standard matter of protecting sources and methods, or fears related to the Geneva Conventions, which you mentioned?
Yes, I mean, I will give you my belief. I considered at the time, why was there so much secrecy, and why was it going to be, why destroy everything, apparently everything in a successful program? One of the things I learned early on is that they created humanitarian organizations in order to ship these parcels. Up to 100 parcels a week were leaving Fort Hunt, but they were never going out under the Red Cross. And there was some suggestion that some of the parcels may have gone out under the Red Cross label. If that were true, and if any of those parcels had been compromised, clearly it would affect America's view of the role of the Red Cross. I always had been told that the Red Cross were never used, but I was also told that there were parts of the program that led it to be necessary to destroy any record of it. I couldn't, apart from that, I could not think of a reason why you would have abandoned such a successful program. I mean, Bob, do you have any ideas why they would have done that?
I'll put it on almost the very practical end of it. As human beings, we can look ahead 3 or 4 years and may see consequences of our activities 3 or 4 years ahead of time, and so we will make decisions based on that kind of horizon. When you get 75 years or 100 years away from an event, those of us, particularly historians like myself, who are looking back on that, say, darn it, why didn't those why'd they classify that, why'd they bury that? For example, my favorite one from CIA, since I was director of the Office of Technical Service, I reflect on that decision by Richard Helms, or order by Richard Helms in 1973, to destroy all of the MK Ultra records. Well, if Google MK Ultra, and you'll only get a couple million hits on the computer, and there is so much conspiracy theory and inaccurate information that's floating around about the MK Ultra program. If we'd had the records, we could clear that up, but we don't, and we'll live with that.
Well, I want to thank all of you for an incredibly moving experience. David Taylor, it's remarkable, the research and the documentaries that you have created and how the stories have all been woven together. Truly, truly amazing. Jim Stockdale, thank you so much for sharing your very personal experience of an incredibly traumatic time. And I just can't even imagine how your dad came home and was a dad again. And I remember those debates. So it's really cool to know a lot more about him. And then my dear friend, Bob Wallace, always a beacon of light in any room. Thank you for shedding more upon this case, and thanks for being part of that documentary so we could learn about this. I'm sure you can see David's films online, and I just want to thank everyone for being here and learning about a very untold story, and check out our website for other upcoming programs. Thank you, everyone.